Hello everyone, my name is Pascal Leboeuf and I'm a composer and pianist, and I'm here to talk to you about chord voicings for pianists. So I'm going to go over a couple different ideas, starting pretty basic and getting pretty advanced. The goal here is not for you to necessarily understand everything that I'm going to say, but for you to get an overview of what there is to learn. And hopefully, this being a video, you can kind of go back and revisit things if you're interested in something. If you're more advanced, then hopefully there'll be something juicy for you. And if you're just starting out, hopefully there'll be something juicy for you too. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. So voicings. What is a voicing? It's just a way that you're interpreting a chord symbol, basically. So you can take a chord like a D minor 7, and you can play it in a number of different ways. You could play it in basic position, which is what we would call the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh. You can also interpret it with more colors, like you can add a ninth, you can add a 13th. Sometimes these are specified, but sometimes they're also implied, so that if you see D minor 7, you know that the function of a minor 13 or a minor 9 or a minor 7, they're all the same function, so you can kind of interchange them depending on what color you're interested in expressing. So here are a couple different voicings that you might use for this one chord. These are some of my favorites. Of course, you can make up your own. You can even come up with collections of them that work over a chord. So this is kind of what we're going to get into. First thing I'm going to say is a good place to start, if you're not already familiar, is making sure that you know all of the basic triads and seventh chords in their most fundamental forms. If you're just starting out, a really fun way to get used to chords is to understand the intervals that create them. So let's say you have no experience in piano at all. If you look at the keyboard and you play every single note up in order, white notes and black notes, you end up with something called the chromatic scale. Most of you probably know this already, but using the chromatic scale, you can actually count intervals to make any chord. So if I start on a note, like a C, and I count the half steps. So C is 0. There's no half step between C and C. If I count one half step above C, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 half steps above C gives me a major third. If I keep counting, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that gives me a perfect fifth. So by counting 4 and then 7, I can make a major triad on any note. So you could try just picking a note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sharp. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is a really good way to just kind of get used to finding major triads. If you're interested in trying to get better at that, or you're having trouble finding something, you can use your ears too, of course, but sometimes it's helpful to not have to rely on your ears if you don't have the luxury or the time to be able to try something out before getting it right. So once you get these set up, you can practice them in a number of different ways. Practice them chromatically. You can practice them in whole steps. You could practice them, and this one's my favorite, in fourths. I like to get my handy dandy metronome out. And this is the kind of thing where if you just do it every day, not for long, for a short period of time, just to make sure you do it, maybe before brushing your teeth, maybe before you have breakfast in the morning, just for 5 minutes, you'll be surprised at how quickly you will internalize this information. you might only have to practice major triads for 4 days before you get them all. You practice them like this. 1, 2, 3, up a fourth. Up a fourth. Every once in a while you have to go back down. And pretty soon, you'll end up back where you started at C. And you've gone through all of the major triads. You can also practice minor triads this way. The way you make a major triad minor is by lowering the third degree. You could also count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You could also count 3 and 7 instead of 4 and 7. But you can also use your ears to be able to tell if it sounds major, happy, or sad minor. An important thing to get used to doing too, when you're at this stage, is practicing what are called inversions. This is called a root position triad. The root of the chord is on the bottom. If you move that up an octave, you end up with what we call first inversion. This is not first and second. This is root position and then first. That confuses a lot of people. So make sure you remember root position, then first inversion. And the next one, if you do it again, it's called second inversion. And can you guess what the next one is? Third inversion. No, it's not third inversion. It's root position again. It's just an octave up. So we have 3 notes. That means there's going to be 3 different inversions: root, first, and second. And you can practice these with your handy dandy metronome. Now I know it's not going to be that fast when you start. So what you can do is you can do it as slowly as it takes to get it all right. Go to the next one. Now there's some fun things you can do with triads. Let's just take a quick break. Talk about triads and inversions. You can use triads and inversions to do fancy tricks like this. So all I'm really doing here is playing root position again. Both hands, just an octave apart. And then doing the next one. And the next one. And then back. Pretty fancy way to I don't know, do something cool. Like let's say you have an intro for a song and you have a G chord. And let's say I'm going to play Happy Birthday. So it's in C, and I want to get there, so I'll play a big 5 chord, a dominant chord going into it. I'll do this. And then you can wink at the audience. So, Happy Birthday is actually a great example of a song that you can use to kind of practice inversions. You can actually play Happy Birthday with pretty much just 1, 4, and a 5 chord, and C, F, and G in different inversions, and it'll work out. So I can go, Happy Birthday to you, Happy Birthday to you, Happy Birthday to you, whatever, Happy Birthday to you. So you could do that with inversions. Notice the bass note is important. I'm playing roots in the bass note. So that's kind of how triads work. And you can play almost any rock song that you hear on the radio just using major and minor triads. It gets a little more complicated. I'm just going to kind of go through some of the other things that you might want to know if you're working with triads. You can use what are called slash chords to specify when you have a different bass note. So let's say I want to play C. If I see a C chord, I can play any inversion with a C in the bass, basically. If I want an E in the bottom, I have to write it as C over E. C/E. And that's why it's called the slash chord. It means C chord in the top over an E bass note. You can do different things, like gospel music uses slash chords a lot. C over E, F over G, A minor over G, D over F sharp, D, C over G again, F over G, F over G again, and then C. You can even use something called sus chord here, which is a suspended third. It means the third's just a little bit. It's one step above. So that's another one we could talk about. C sus. It's not a reference to the sustain pedal. It's a reference to a suspended third. It's like it's hanging in the air and waiting to resolve. It's up in the air and then it resolves. You can also do it with minor chords. There's also something that's a little more informal called a sus2. If you see a chord that says something like C sus2, it means the same kind of idea, where you're usually waiting to resolve to the third. You could even use both. C sus and C sus2. C. You can practice these with your metronome, of course, doing things like this. So there are two other ones that you might want to know about, which are the augmented and the diminished chord. So to augment something means to make it bigger. To diminish something means to make it smaller. And these refer to the fifth. See, the fifth, it's what's called a perfect interval, as opposed to a major and a minor interval. If it's major or minor, it can really only be one thing or another thing. If it's a perfect interval, then it can usually be perfect, augmented, or diminished. So that's three things. So if we have a fifth, we can augment that fifth by making it bigger. That'd be like C to G sharp. Or we can diminish it by making it smaller. It'd be like C to G flat. So you can use these with triads. Here's a C major triad. Here's a minor triad. This is what's a diminished triad. Everything is small, so the third is small and the fifth is small. Similarly, with an augmented triad, the fifth is large and the third is as big as it gets, major. So those are all of your triads that you're probably going to come in contact with. Now I'm going to move on to some more advanced ideas. So when we talk about chords, there are all these different ways that we refer to chords with numbers. We might refer to a 1 chord or a 5 chord, which means, like, if we're in a key like C, C is one chord of the key. So C is 1. We go up in scale degrees, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this is the 5 chord of the key. But we can also talk about numbers in terms of intervals, like we were doing earlier, which is kind of similar. This is scale degrees again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on. And we can have different types of intervals where they're major 7, minor 7, etc. And you should probably review your intervals. I'm not going to go into that right now, but you might want to practice kind of going through the intervals. Major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, perfect octave. And of course you have the minor ones, so you can do chromatic scale. Perfect unison, let's say minor second, minor third, major fourth, augmented fourth, or diminished fifth more commonly. Perfect fifth, augmented fifth, or minor sixth, depending on how it's written. Major sixth, minor seventh, major seventh, perfect octave. Okay, that's all the review of intervals I'm going to do for now, except that I'm going to also mention that when we talk about numbers again, in addition to talking about scale degrees or about numbers of chords, like 2, 5, 1s, for example, We can also be talking about chord tones with numbers. So let's say I'm talking about a 2 chord. That would mean in the key of C, 2 chord would be a chord based on a D. Now, I can call this the root, second, third of that chord. So you see how it gets kind of confusing. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the key, but now we're talking about a chord. So I'm going to use different numbers here, and they're all based on the root of the chord. So in chord theory, we tend to use something called tertiary harmony, which means chords are based in thirds. Tertiary means 3, like tricycle, tertiary. So if we go up a chord like this, like D minor, for example, in the key of C, we can keep going until we get to D again, and we end up back where we started, right? But we can call these with numbers that relate to thirds as opposed to the scale. We can say root, third, fifth, 7, 9, 11, 13. And we're back to the root again. In jazz, you see a lot of chord symbols that refer to the 9th, the 11th, 13th, 7th. So I'm going to try to demystify that a little bit for you here. Let's start with the 7th. First of all, they're basically, you can have a major third and a minor third. You can have a major 7 and a minor 7. So there are basically 4 different options using those variables. Both are major. You have what's called a C major 7. Both are minor. You have what's called a C minor 7. So I'm talking about both the thirds and the 7ths of the chords. Now, that's pretty easy to remember. Everything's major, it's called a major 7. Everything's minor, it's called a minor 7. Piece of cake, right? Now, if one is major and one's minor, it's a little trickier. If you have a major triad with a minor 7th, that means an interval of a minor 7th. I'll call it a flat 7 for now. If we're thinking of a scale, let's say. This is what we would just call a C7. Notice, it's just letter number. Pretty much every time you see a chord that's letter number, if it's C7, C9, C13, it's basically going to refer to this chord. It's always going to be a 5 chord. And you can also call it a dominant 7th. Okay, C7. Now, one that's a little less common is if you have a minor triad with a major 7th. You might hear this in like spy music, Secret Agent 007, James Bond. So this is called a minor major 7th. Minor triad, major 7th. Got it? Cool. Those are basically the 4 7th chords that you're going to see. Okay. You might also see some things, some exceptions to these, like say C minor 7 flat 5, also known as a half diminished chord. You might also see a fully diminished chord, which means it's got a major 7, minor 7, diminished 7. You would write this as a B double flat. This is like a villain has tied somebody to the train tracks. Somebody needs to save them. I'll save you. Okay, cool. So that's a diminished 7. We can come back to that later. And you might also see an augmented 7, C7. See augmented 7. It's like C plus symbol with a 7 on it. Or C augmented major 7. Those are pretty unusual chords. So I'm only going to briefly mention them at this point, but they're pretty cool. The reason I'm kind of going through all of this is that in order to kind of take it to the next step in terms of piano voicings, you need to be very familiar with these terms and to be able to kind of create these chords. And like I was saying before, you can practice them with your metronome. You can practice them in fourths. You can practice them chromatically. Do whatever you want, really. As long as you're spending time thinking about them, then you're practicing. You can even do it in your head away from a piano. If you can visualize a piano keyboard in your head, that's a good mind trick to try doing if you're stuck somewhere. The reason why I'm kind of going over all this is because once you have this firmly in place, you can start building more advanced voicings off of these. There are some really helpful voicings that I like to use called rootless voicings. And you kind of, the idea is that you're playing a chord without the root in it, because the bassist can play the root, or maybe you can play the root in your left hand. These come in handy a lot for a lot of reasons, and I'll tell you more about that in a sec. But the basic premise behind them is that you start with a chord, like, let's say a C7 chord. You replace the root with the ninth. You replace the fifth, sometimes, if it makes sense, with the 13th. You might also replace the fifth with the 11th. The main thing is that you will always have a third and a seventh, and then you can choose either a root or a ninth. You can choose either a fifth or a 13th or a 11 or something next to the fifth, and then you can get these pretty cool voicings. My two kind of favorite inversions to practice these in, the ones that I learned, are the following, and you can practice these. I'll include them in your handout so you don't have to remember them here. But let's start with a D. Let's do a 2-5-1 in C. So we're going to start with a D minor 9, using the minor third, flat 3, fifth, flat 7, 9. We're just moving one finger. And then we've got a G13, flat 7, 9, third, 13. And we have a C major 9, third, fifth, 7, 9. Major third, 7th, of course. You can also use an inversion when you take the bottom two and you put them up and you end up with this. The reason it's nice to practice two different inversions is so that you can get around pretty quickly. So those are rootless voicings. A couple of things to keep in mind. You ever see something called a sus7? It's basically a 5 chord in disguise. You can interpret it as a 2 over a 5. So if you see G7 sus, G sus, the holiest of chords. Just kidding. Okay, we've got D minor 7 to G7 to C. You can just think of the G sus chord as D minor 7 over G. 2 over a 5. It sounds kind of like, 80s. You can even move it around. Sounds kind of like Stevie Wonder or something. I can just pick a bunch of random notes and play sus chords and it'll sound pretty hip. Check it out. You can also do things like if you wanted to play a minor 2-5-1, that'd be like a D minor 7 flat 5 to a G13 flat 9 to a C minor major 7. Let's use our minor major 7. Now you'll notice some things. I'm using rootless voicing, so I'm adding ninths and 13s to things, and that's just a way to kind of get a more colorful sound. You can also not use those. Like I could use, for minor 2-5-1s in particular, sometimes the ninth can get in the way, so I'll just leave it out. We can call it G altered chord. Now let's just kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about some of these numbers, these higher numbers here. We've talked about 1, 3, 5, and 7 quite a bit here, but we haven't talked about 9, 11, and 13 that much. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you're only going to have 3 more numbers after 7. These are called extensions because you're extending a chord past the octave. So when you're dealing with a chord like a D minor 7, for example, you can, as I was saying before, you can interpret it with these extra notes if you want to, and it'll have the same function. But there are some things to keep in mind. On chords, on most chords, if you have a number like a 13, it implies the numbers below it. 13 implies 11, implies a 9, implies a 7. So if you see a D minor 13, that means you can also play an 11, a 9, a 7, and it's all cool. There's one exception, which is that if the chord has a major third, then sometimes there's a conflict between the 11 and the third. So if you see something like a C13, that 11th can sound kind of bad. So often, if it's got a major third, we'll just leave out the 11. But a 13 still implies a 9, a 9 still implies a 7, and so on. If you have a sharp 11, no problem. Okay, that's a cool voicing, by the way. You can take a C7 chord and put a D triad on top of it. Fun way to end a blues, for example. Okay, so we've talked about rootless voicings, we've talked about extensions. There's something else you should know about, and I've been kind of hinting at these. They're called alterations. Alterations are basically when you alter an extension. And the good news is there are only 4 options, really, for the alterations that you're going to see. If you have a C7 again, let's make it a C9. You can also have a sharp 9 or a flat 9. So when you have a C sharp 9 or flat 9, they kind of have the same function. So if you're thinking about one or the other, it's not that important a difference, because a flat 9 implies a sharp 9 in the scale, and a sharp 9 implies a flat 9 in the scale. So you can be a little bit loose in your interpretation of those, unless the music is really specific about it, because it's in the melody or something like that. But in general, you're going to be fine kind of interpreting the altered 9 in either way. Now, with the 11th, we already talked about how the 11th is problematic if it's a major third. So you're probably not going to see a chord called a C11. You might see something called a C7 sus, which we talked about. But you're probably not going to see a C11. What you might see, though, is a C7 sharp 11, which is a pretty hip chord that we just talked about a second ago with the D major triad. You'll never see a C7 flat 11, because a flat 11 doesn't exist. It's the same as the major third. So right now we got flat 9, sharp 11. Let's check out the 13. 13, you're only going to see one option. You can have a flat 13, but you can't have a sharp 13. This is the same as the flat 7. So we've gone through, there are 4 different alterations that you can have on a chord. Flat 9, sharp 11, and flat 13. That's it. If you have all 4 of those at the same time, you get what's called an altered chord. Pretty awesome. I think I'm going to talk about that a little more later. But if you can't play all of the notes in an altered chord, that's totally okay. You usually have to pick a couple and just see what happens. You could, for example, play the same voicing that you would use for a C7 sharp 9 for an altered chord. You're not specifying the 13, so you're not going to get in trouble. As long as you're playing it, if you're improvising. memorize it or if it's in the melody. You could sneak it in though, or you could sneak in the sharp 11. You're probably not going to see all of them. It takes a lot of fingers to make that chord. But there you go. So we've gone through 1, 3, 5, and 7, different types of 7 chords. We've gone through how to structure rootless voicings and some different rootless voicings you can practice. We've gone through extensions, which are chordal tones that exceed the octave. And we've gone through alterations, which are when extensions are altered. Closing up this chapter, I'm just going to say that if you're working with rootless voicings, if you want to make an altered chord with a rootless voicing, you simply need to look at it and make the appropriate modifications. So here's a G13 chord. I'm just going to raise the 9 to make it a sharp 9. And I'm going to flat the 13 to make it a flat 13. I'm not going to play the sharp 11 on this chord. I like that. So you can practice 2, 5, 1s this way too. So those are some good tricks for getting used to your rootless voicings. That's probably plenty for most of you, probably more than you expected to go over already. But now I'm going to show you some cool tricks that I really liked when I was learning about voicings. I'm going to show you some cool voicings. One sound that I really liked when I figured out what it was called is the sound of quartal harmony. We talked about tertiary harmony, which is chords based in thirds, but you can also base them in fourths. And then you get stuff that sounds like this. So what chords? Those are really fun. They're also what McCoy Tyner uses a lot. You get these situations where he'll play like big fifth in the bottom. And he'll play fourths, diatonic fourths. Diatonic means it comes from a scale. So if I just went up all the white notes with this shape, those are diatonic fourths. And one thing that's cool that McCoy did a lot is that he used pentatonic scales to improvise. In this C major scale, over a 2 chord, a D minor, all white notes. There are actually 3 pentatonic scales. We've got a C pentatonic, an F pentatonic scale, and a G pentatonic scale. So one thing McCoy did a lot is he would use these voicings, these fourth voicings, and he would play pentatonic scales over them. So watch, I'm just going to use fifth and play some diatonic fourths, and then I'm going to mess around with an F pentatonic scale. I'm just going to play different notes in it. It'd be like playing all the black notes. Except down a step. Sounds like this. So, that's how you get that sound. McCoy also did a lot of sidestepping, which is where you kind of move in or out of the key that you're in by a half step. You could take a voicing, or maybe the pentatonic scale, or even the major scale that you're using, and just go up a half step, for example. And you can get this really fun kind of tension that when you resolve, it feels really good. It sounds kind of like this. I'm just going to do the same thing I just did, except I'm going to go up a half step a little bit before it resolves. So one thing you can do if you're interested in that is practice your diatonic fourths, but also practice them a half step up. You can even use both hands. that's kind of how you get that sound. And you can even switch between pentatonic scales in your top hand, F, C, G. Doing half steps for all of them. So that's how you get that sound. A couple other voicings that I really like. There's one that I like that my teacher Kenny Barron uses a lot. You make it by basically stacking fifths a half step apart. So if I stack fifths in my left hand, it's pretty wide. You have to be careful with your hands. If you're not used to wide intervals, make sure you practice carefully and take breaks. So you do the same thing in your right hand, a half step above. You get this beautiful wide sound. You can move it around. I'm just moving it around. You can go up a scale this way. This is not diatonic here. What that means is that I'm treating each root, each one of these notes as a root, and playing a minor 11 chord. You can also pick random notes, like let's go up a blues scale. I mean, there's a song there. There's a song there. You could compose music that way. You can also do it with a major second in between the two hands. You get this beautiful sharp 11 voicing. Major 7, sharp 11. Let's try that one with the blues scale. Pretty fancy. You could experiment with different things too, putting different intervals in between these chords. It gets a little complicated and interesting in a nice way, because these fifths are so consonant that if you put weird spaces between them, it kind of works out. Another voicing I really like is one where you take for a minor 13 chord, is you just stack the thirds like we did. Now, this is really just root, third, fifth, 7, 9, 11, 13, and root again. Seems pretty straightforward, but it can sound really great rolled. Pedal down, roll it like that. You can move it around different ways. And a really easy way to practice it too is you just think of a chord like a D minor 7, and you go up a step to an E, and you make another D minor 7, except E minor 7 in this case. And then you end up with this 2 stacked minor 7 chords. So let's do our blues scale. Pretty cool. You can even play songs like In a Sentimental Mood. Kind of cool trick. Of course, it takes practice to be able to make them that quickly. So that's why it's important that you really get comfortable with your 7th chords so that you can stack them and find them quickly. You're definitely capable of doing it. It just takes time. It just takes time the same way that you learn to speak. You spend a lot of time trying to make sounds, and then eventually you can string together sentences, and eventually you can speak about philosophy. It's the same with jazz. So when I think about how to get comfortable with voicings and how to get comfortable comping, things like this, it's really just a matter of spending time thinking about music. And that can be done at your instrument. It can be done when you're listening with headphones. It can be done when you're waiting for the subway and you're just picturing a piano in your mind and practicing your triad inversions. These are all great ways to get fluent. And of course, it's wonderful to play along with records that you like to listen to try to understand why sounds are likable, why you're drawn to a sound. What's the reason why something sounds good to you? If you think about it, you can probably figure it out. And using these terms can be very helpful in that regard. Well, let's see. I think that's about all I have for you today. If you're interested in exploring piano voicings further, I highly recommend a book by Mark Levine called The Jazz Piano Book. Mark Levine is a wonderful academic. He was my teacher briefly when I was living in California back in the day, and he has a very organized approach to teaching voicings and jazz piano styles. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend getting that book and going over some of these ideas in more detail. Another thing that's really important to do is ask your friends what their favorite voicings are. Ask if you go to a show and you see somebody that you like, say a pianist is coming through town and playing at a jazz club, go up to them after the concert and ask them what their favorite voicing is. And I'm sure they'd be happy to tell you and probably have some good ideas. So don't be afraid to talk to your peers and talk to your teachers and musicians. Just it's a great thing to just ask casually. What are some of your favorite voicings? And if you're comfortable with this language too, they can probably even tell you like what the voicings are without a piano. Though it might be helpful to write them down. And finally, just make sure you're always listening. The most helpful thing you can do to get comfortable with voicings and learning to play jazz is to listen to it and to find a way in. Find things that you love about it. Find artists that you're drawn to, and pay attention to the things that you like. Because if you like it, that's the most important thing. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Happy music making.